Hello everybody, I would like to salute you from Middle East Technical University. This is the first class of our first sequence in architectural history. The course is Architectural History 1 and the code of the course is ARCH 112. Today we will embark upon early beginnings and we shall journey to Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük. These are among the earliest architectural achievements. And at this point, you probably would be interested to know what is architecture? Why do we study architecture? What is important about studying architecture from ages past? What is significant about studying architecture which goes back several thousand years? Is there something to learn from that? Well, this is an exciting journey of the built environment. It's a very exciting journey indeed. It's the journey of mankind. But the journey of mankind does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place in an environment. And it is a very long sequence indeed, with responses to how to live better, initially how to survive, how to feed, how to shelter, and then life became more sophisticated with the generation of more sophisticated social structures. If we look at this first slide here, you see the Greek philosopher Diogenes. This is a dwelling. He was a philosopher who rejected all the amenities in the world. He rejected luxuries. He was a reductionist. He felt that even the simplest was sufficient for survival. So you see that his dwelling was a huge pot, nothing else. He lived there, he slept there, he ate there. This was the simplest form of dwelling that you can probably imagine, even though it might be exaggerated. On the other end of the spectrum, if we try to think about which monuments we study, especially from the earliest periods, we need one significant ingredient, and that is survival. Unfortunately, not all that man has built has survived until our time, because they did not resist the ravages of time. So this brings another question to mind. Are the survivals only monuments? What is a monument? Sometimes what was built to be a monument is what survives. And it's not necessarily the story of mankind as a response to the environment. But in time, if the response of man to the environment survives, then that can become a monument. So it is important to keep in mind that all that we study, all that is very, very interesting, was not necessarily built to be a monument, but it is a testimony to the story of man and the built environment. And this is a very long time period indeed. Architecture exists in space, but it also exists in time. Time has many layers, as you see in this the olive tree from the island of Crete. It happens to be the oldest tree in the world, so to speak, and you see the intertwined branches. You see the body, which is churning, turning. It is alive. It witnessed many, many events in the world. So this is a natural artifact. And here you see another natural artifact, the natural tree, which is in an embrace with a rock. Again, we are talking about natural environments. And man's story in the built environment is negotiating with the built environment and turning the built environment into the architectural specimens that we shall study. But there are ethical. Hello everybody, I would like to salute you from Middle East Technical University. This is the first class of our first sequence in architectural history. The course is Architectural History 1 and the code of the course is ARCH 112. Today we will embark upon early beginnings and we shall journey to Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük. These are among the earliest architectural achievements. And at this point, you probably would be interested to know what is architecture? Why do we study architecture? What is important about studying architecture from ages past? What is significant about studying architecture which goes back several thousand years? Is there something to learn from that? Well, this is an exciting journey of the built environment. It's a very exciting journey indeed. It's the journey of mankind. But the journey of mankind does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place in an environment. And it is a very long sequence indeed, with responses to how to live better, initially how to survive, how to feed, how to shelter, and then life became more sophisticated with the generation of more sophisticated social structures. If we look at this first slide here, you see the Greek philosopher Diogenes. This is a dwelling. He was a philosopher who rejected all the amenities in the world. He rejected luxuries. He was a reductionist. He felt that even the simplest was sufficient for survival. So you see that his dwelling was a huge pot, nothing else. He lived there, he slept there, he ate there. This was the simplest form of dwelling that you can probably imagine, even though it might be exaggerated. On the other end of the spectrum, if we try to think about which monuments we study, especially from the earliest periods, we need one significant ingredient, and that is survival. Unfortunately, not all that man has built has survived until our time, because they did not resist the ravages of time. So this brings another question to mind. Are the survivals only monuments? What is a monument? Sometimes what was built to be a monument is what survives, and it's not necessarily the story of mankind as a response to the environment. But in time, if the response of man to the environment survives, then that can become a monument. So it is important to keep in mind that all that we study, all that is very, very interesting, was not necessarily built to be a monument, but it is a testimony to the story of man and the built environment. And this is a very long time period indeed. Architecture exists in space, but it also exists in time. Time has many layers, as you see in this the olive tree from the island of Crete. It happens to be the oldest tree in the world, so to speak, and you see the intertwined branches. You see the body, which is turning. It is alive. It witnessed many, many events in the world. So this is a natural artifact. And here you see another natural artifact, the natural tree, which is in an embrace with a rock. Again, we are talking about natural environments. And man's story in the built environment is negotiating with the built environment and turning the built environment into the architectural specimens that we shall study. But there are ethical issues here as well. If we look at Antalya, for example, the eroded cliffs that we all know that we call falaise, or falaise coming from, French, we see that that is a character of Antalya and the geology there. And when you look at the picture more carefully, you see the sorry, I'm doing something wrong with the slides, here. Yes, we are back into sequence. You see that the man-built, environment is on top. The houses, the modern houses, are encroaching toward the natural cliffs here, which have been there for centuries and centuries. And now the municipality there wants to create an artificial light, which is an intervention. So when we have these interventions, we should try to be in marriage with nature as much as possible, rather than fighting with nature. So our story from the very earliest beginnings to the present time in which we live will be a story of how we negotiate with the environment and how we find the solutions to live a better existence. And in this regard, since you are all training to become architects, you are candidates to become architects, you should develop skills of inquisitiveness, visual inquisitiveness. You should always be on the watch out of what is happening outside. And here I am showing you a sort of shaking slide from a bus window. I was traveling once, and when the bus stopped at a gas station, what I saw was something very peculiar. You see a house here, and in the house, you have a little veranda here. You have a door. You have a window, but the stairs that you see lead to the window, and the door is inaccessible. This is an equation which invites questioning. This does not fit a common logic. And in that regard, when you are designing buildings, you should be very careful about how you are going to bring together the need, the material, and the solution. The story that we shall be going on in this class is a very long story, and we shall be jumping not only centuries, but even millennia. And this is not a settled story, because every year new information, new data is enriching this exciting adventure. For example, there are Neolithic tunnels which are being discovered in northern Europe. There are underwater cities that are, emerging, and every new discovery will reshape our knowledge of what is already available. So sometimes we discover that what we consider as an explanation for why a structure is the way it is may not actually be so. It is our interpretation, and new information will help to set us in the right track. Now, let us go to the time frame, because this time frame is not a time frame with which you are very familiar. We are not talking about a distance of 1 or 2 years. We're not talking about a distance of decades, 10 years. We're not talking about a distance, a chronological distance, even of centuries. but we are talking about millennia. So in the early ages, geological time becomes intertwined with archaeological time. To give you an idea, let's look at this chart here. Let's look at how the climatic situation in the world began to shape how men lived in the world. You have to imagine the world in the Ice Age covered with ice. This was a period which lasted about 70,000 years, not 17, 70. And 70,000 years. This is an incredibly long time, architecturally speaking. But within that time, when we begin to see the traces of the human intervention in the environment in which he lives, we can go back to 12,000 BC, as you see on the slide. In 12,000 BC, what happened? The ice began to recede. The ice began to, melt. And then it took another 3,000 years before something else happened. This is a very, very slow process. So in 9,500 BC, we begin to see the first settlements built at Jericho in the Near East. And our story for this class begins at 9,000 BC, here. And at 9,000 BC, we know that Göbekli Tepe in southeast Anatolia, which we shall look at in greater detail today, was very, very significant. There are other settlements like Nevali Chori, which followed Göbekli Tepe, that is also in southeast Anatolia. And then the second site that we shall talk about is Çatalhöyük, closer to central Anatolia. And there we are talking about a time frame which goes back to 7,200 BC. Now, these are all the man-made environments. These are all environments which we can trace back to these early ages. But to give you an idea of how momentous those changes are, maybe it is helpful to look at the geological formations. In 6,500 BC, for example, Britain was formed. I mean, we all know Britain, north of Europe, is an island. And it was in 6,500 BC that Britain became an island. And then closer to home is the Black Sea. The Black Sea that we all know about. And the Black Sea was formed in 5,600 BC. And then as we jump again several millennia to 3,000 BC and the 2,600 BC, we begin to see the first cities in Mesopotamia, further to the east between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then further to the south, we have the era of the pyramids. And this sequence will continue as we go along in the different weeks of the class. Let us now begin with how the story first began. Men were not originally settled. They were hunter-gatherers. They were hunter-gatherers because they had to follow the sources of food to survive. And since there was no farming at the very early age, they moved where the source of food was. They hunted wild animals collectively, and then they collected wild berries, wild grains, wild grasses. And once the food supply was finished, then they had to move elsewhere. So these early ancestors of ours lived in caves. They moved from one cave to another. And we have examples of these caves also in Anatolia. In Karain, for example, very close to Antalya, we have the finds that date back to very early ages, to the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic Age. And from these caves, we have no architecture, since man was utilizing natural environments, but we have finds which they shaped. And their early tools, their early decorations were all from the natural materials that they could find, like stone or the bones of animals. And on this screen, you see a belt buckle. And all of this is primarily a product from the animal that was hunted, killed, eaten, and then the bones and then the fur of the animal provided the shelter or food or dressing. Another example is here in the form of a cutting tool. Here you see the edge, the sharp edge of a bone. Here you have a piercing instrument, and at the far right hand of the slide you see a handle to which was probably attached another cutting edge. So all these tools were procured from the animals that were hunted. Even the decorations that these early ancestors used were from animals in the form of amulets. On the screen are the teeth that you see, pierced teeth, which probably became shaped into necklaces that these early ancestors carried around their necks, probably as amulets, more than a concern about how they actually looked. Let us now look at the map. I said that the southeastern part of Turkey, southeast Anatolia, was very important in the story of the built environment. This is a very special area. Today it is the area which is including Syria, Iraq, and including southeast Turkey. If you look more carefully, you see that there are two water courses, the Euphrates river here and the Tigris river to the right. And the northern part of these rivers is south of the Taurus mountain range, which was forested once the snows began to melt. So there's a lot of water here. There are savanna lands, grasslands here, and then there are the outskirts of the forested mountains. So the area became quite significant for the early ancestors as a choice in which they shaped the environment. And it is here that we have the discoveries of Göbekli Tepe. I mean, here you see Göbekli Tepe. It's not very far from Urfa. It's about 17 kilometers from Şanlıurfa, which is close to Gaziantep, as you see here. And another site which followed Göbekli Tepe is Nevali Chori, but we shall not see any examples from Nevali Chori. Why is Göbekli Tepe important? Not only because it is early, but because it gives us some extraordinary clues which are spectacular about our earliest ancestors. And these clues are still harboring questions about whether it was the settled life that gave rise to farming, or whether farming gave rise to settled life. Here, there seems to be another issue at stake, and it might be a religious impulse. With the end of the hunting-gathering, society, because we don't have the evidence for residences around here, not a great deal of, residence, we seem to think that these hunter, gatherers had a kind of religious gathering place. So the material remains of these religious impulses are extraordinary because they are so monumental and they precede the settled environment, which we see in the form of simple farming communities. Göbekli Tepe was known as early as the 1960s, but nobody really realized how important it was. It was even published. Some of the surface findings from there was published, but it was not until 1995 when the German archaeologists Harald Hauptmann and Klaus Schmidt began working there. And with their work, we started to encounter these extraordinary remains. Monumental structures in stone, monumental slabs in stone. And this, of course, invites questions about settled life, because it is not the feat, it is not a possible feat for one or two individuals to carve these stones, let alone transport them from the source of the quarry and then erect them. Obviously, there had to be an organization of social life where the labor could be shared in order to make possible this teamwork to erect these structures. What is spectacular about these finds? The finds are major in stone. We have a series of circular enclosures. About 20 of them have been discovered until now. 6 of them have been revealed. The 2 have been explored in greater detail. And in these, we have a circular enclosure. The circular enclosure is defined by a corridor, which is defined by 2 sets of upright slabs. And these upright slabs are connected by sort of the masonry. I mean, not cut stone masonry, but the bits and pieces of stone. In the center are 2 other upright slabs, and the floor is hardened in the form of a terrazzo floor. In other words, they were trying to make these quite durable. There was an intention to create long-lasting structures that would endure. But there's another peculiar feature, and that is the evidence, the archaeological evidence, that there are several levels of destruction. It seems that these circular enclosures, together with the slabs, were demolished and built over. Demolished and built over. So there is a continuity of memory here, a continuity of religious impulse, a continuity of memory. The religion here is not surprisingly emanating or inspired by the flora and the fauna all around. And this makes sense because it is linked to the lifestyle of the hunter-gatherers who were still roaming about in gathering their food. The animals that we see depicted on these stone slabs are quite identifiable. They are not grotesque, fantastic, creatures, but they are animals that we can easily identify. So here you see a lion, for example, with the ferocious mouth, threatening mouth here, and then a rather massive body with the tail emanating upwards. Another stone slab here shows a fox. The artistic sensibility here is very minimalist, but it is superb. If you look at the fox more carefully, you see one huge sweep of the body. The neck joins with the torso of the animal, and then it terminates with the tail. This one bold curve gives every sense of a very agile and fast-moving animal. So the animals that are depicted were obviously the animals our ancestors were familiar with, and then these familiar animals became represented on the stele in their recognized features, agility in this case. There are a lot of other animals as well which are depicted, snakes among them, but very little human representation. The human representation is a kind of exception, as a matter of fact. If we look at the site itself, it is a site which is now very visible in the land which is around it, because it rises as a land which has been built upon. So we know that in archaeology you have höyüks, and the höyüks, as we shall see shortly, are composed of strata, layers of occupation, and here the slight rise in the land belongs to these man-made features which make Göbekli Tepe recognizable. So Klaus Schmidt with Harald Hautmann started excavating this höyük, Göbekli Tepe, and since 2007 a lot of new information has been added, but all the questions have not been answered. I mean, what exactly were these circular structures with upright stone slabs in them? What was their purpose? What dictated these people, who obviously had a religious community, to go ahead with such a project in the absence of the houses, in the absence of other forms of living? Then Klaus Schmidt continued the excavations after 2007. The excavations revealed more of these structures. You see the upright slabs here. Some of them, I mean the oldest of them, is 7 meters high. That is monumental. Then there are slabs which are 4 meters high, and most commonly they're about 1.5 meters high. So the slabs were arranged in a circular format, and they were connected with walls made of rubble, and in the center were 2 other slabs which were higher than the others, and most of these were they housed depictions of the wild animals that I have been talking about. Here's a reconstruction. You see the double corridors here, the slabs in the center and then the proximity of the circular enclosures to one another. But we have to wait for further excavations. Unfortunately, Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, but the path that he created to ask the right questions about what these structures meant, because they are incredibly monumental for that level of society. We will be looking for further answers. The only exception of non-animal the representation is a female figure giving birth here, but it is an exception, and it probably had something to do with fertility, sustenance, and continuity, but we should not over-interpret that. Here I open a parenthesis because you must be wondering about how archaeologists uncover their evidence, how archaeologists go about designing projects to reveal the earliest episodes of mankind. Here we see a höyük. As I said earlier, a höyük is a man-made mound, but it is not an artificially built mound. It is a mound which is composed of layers of occupation, which are called stratum, strata in plural. So the longer an occupation has occurred, the higher or larger a höyük will be. So the archaeologist will decide how to proceed about the höyük, because the archaeologist wants to find out who lived there, whether there's a continuity of the occupation, whether certain occupations were interrupted and others, were built after an interval. All these questions are questions for the archaeologist. And in this regard, they work very closely with architects. And many of you can have a summer practice working in an archaeological excavation as an architect in mapping and recording. After a höyük is gridded, a grid plan is created, then a systematic excavation begins. And in that systematic excavation, you have trenches. These trenches will, with proper excavation, reveal what is inside, and the architects, together with the other experts, will begin recording these remains. In this höyük, you see that a huge trench has been opened from top, coming down to the bottom, in order to reveal the numbers of occupation, and then further detailed work will go on in the selected areas. Here is the mapping. You see the grid map, you see the layout of the trenches here, and the trenches don't always follow what is underneath. You might have a trench which reveals nothing, or you might have a trench which reveals something that continues in another trench. So systematically you build up the information and try to come up with more refined findings, as you see in this slide. Here you see the walls, you see the pits, the garbage pits, and then accompanying the material remains of architecture, there will be many small finds, pottery, other objects in stone or metal, and all of these will be used in dating the höyük. And here you see pots which are buried in a house. So this is the brief story about what archaeologists do, how archaeologists go about their work, and how they design their excavation, and how these excavations reveal information for architectural historians also, as far as the early periods are concerned. Now we go back to our chronological story of the built environment again. And I would like to begin with the Stone Age here. We are now moving toward the 6,000s, the years 6000. We are moving from Göbekli Tepe, the monumental architecture of the Göbekli Tepe, to the other evidences of Central Anatolia, Çatalhöyük. So you see Çatalhöyük here, very close to the Konya Plain. So here is, Göbekli Tepe here, in the northern part of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers here, and you see the Taurus mountains, and then further to the west in south central Anatolia, we have Çatalhöyük, which was a very important site. The area I would like to mention very briefly is important for other important sites as well. You see the map of Cyprus, and in Cyprus there's a site which is called Kirokitia here. And this is an example which shows how information becomes transformed. You reveal an information, you make an interpretation of it, you try to make an interpretation, a logical interpretation, utilizing the evidence, but then with further evidence, the information becomes obsolete, and you have to move into another category of explanation. Kirokitia is a good example, of that, because in the Kirokitia, you see these oval, houses, which are beehive shaped, in the shape of, beehives, and in the absence of, writing, in the absence of written records, in the absence of the verbal testimony of the people who lived there, well, you have to interpret the material evidence. You have to interpret the houses, you have to interpret the structures, you have to decide whether they are public, whether they are private, you have to decide why they are large, why they are small. You have to decide why they're built in a particular place, and then you make a series of deductions. And in the Kirokitia, you see that there is a major area here. It was very attractive for the archaeologists at that time to talk about a linear settlement. A linear settlement where hierarchies were determined by proximity and the size of the structures, proximity to the area here of the different houses, and then the sizes of the structures. You see that some of them are large, some of them are smaller. And in this sense, this was decided to be the regulator of the layout of the settlement. But now it turns out that that is actually a wall. So there is a reinterpretation, and the information is changing very fast. That is what I mean by how the new discoveries and new interpretations in archaeology continue to shape and reshape architectural history. Now back to Çatalhöyük, our story. As I said, here we are in central Anatolia. Here are the Taurus, mountains. And for this part of the lecture, we shall continue with Çatalhöyük and then briefly deal with Hacılar, that is slightly later than Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük, when it was first discovered in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, it was regarded as the Neolithic revolution. Neo means new. Lithic comes from lithos, the Greek word stone. So it was the new Stone Age. And this was, again, a phase in the evolution of men, whereby they shaped their lives with the sophistication and expertise of utilizing and producing tools. In Çatalhöyük, the Jim Mellard, who began the excavations, opened very important questions. But like Klaus Schmidt of Göbekli Tepe, he also could not continue with the excavations on the site. And because he was the one who started Çatalhöyük and the knowledge production in Çatalhöyük, it was not touched by other scholars for a long time, until Ian Hodder from Stanford University came. And now Ian Hodder, whom you see on the screen, is the person who is going ahead with the excavations in Çatalhöyük, which is an international archaeological project, still yielding new results and yielding more sophisticated results. Çatalhöyük first entered the literature in architectural history with this very famous fresco. It is a fresco which was interpreted to show a volcanic quality. The Hasan Dağı, which is a skiing center, right now, and it showed some configurations below, Hasan Dağı. This configuration, here, with spurting substances from the top, was interpreted as a volcano in the process of eruption, an active volcano. And then in the outskirts of that are these square shaped representations in a grid pattern, which were interpreted as the Çatalhöyük houses. Like Kirokitia, where the knowledge changed, what made Çatalhöyük very famous, this fresco with the so-called settlement of Çatalhöyük below the volcano was very, very convenient to begin the early history, because it showed a settled life. So in all books of architectural history, you begin with Çatalhöyük, showing the volcano and showing the gridded layout of the site there. But when you look at the stratification, the strata in Çatalhöyük, and when you look at the evidence which is there, this is not the picture that you get. If we interpret this fresco, this wall painting in a literal manner, we have to assume that there are streets that cut each other at right angles, at 90-degree angles. Well, that is not the case. And you also have to you also have to consider that if there are streets, well, you have to have doors of the houses that open to these streets. How are you going to have access to the street? Well, in the certain phases of Çatalhöyük, that was also not the case. And then there were other interpretations which claimed that this is not the earliest map of a the secrets of which we can't, explore, right now. But that is a projection which has not gained a great deal of favor, and we still stick with this very famous image showing the earliest city, the earliest representation of one of the early cities from the Neolithic period. These studies in Çatalhöyük are revealing the information increasingly, but when Mellard first excavated the Çatalhöyük in the 1950s and made his groundbreaking discoveries, he had excavated only 3 or 4% of the site. That was a very small, area. And now a lot more is excavated, and the excavations are continuing, as I said, in a multidisciplinary manner. And if you recall what I said at the beginning of my lecture, that is the marriage with the environment, in order to understand the man-made environment, you have to look at the setting first. What kind of soil do you have? What kind of climate do you have? What kind of materials, do you have? And the early studies show that Çatalhöyük was inundated. I mean, annually, with the rains, the wet seasons. There was, a kind of flooding which left behind mud. And this mud was the substance from which the houses were actually constructed. So you have the material already in your own, environment. In Göbekli Tepe, we talked about the material for the stones being, quarried and transported. And here in the Çatalhöyük houses, we are talking about the local, mud brick. And this is a configuration in the eye of the archaeologists who were, working there. Çatalhöyük, as the name suggests, is actually 2 höyüks. Çatal means a fork. So there are 2 höyüks here. And as I mentioned, the excavation procedure of stratified, man-made the mounds, Çatalhöyük is indeed a good one. And here you see an aerial, view of the excavations that are going on. And here you see the, trenches, and within the, trenches, you see the recording which is, going on by the archaeologists and the architects. And here you see the umbrellas where the recorders, work all day long, measuring and recording everything that is recovered. If you compare this, the reconstructed evidence from the actual, site, you will see that it doesn't really match the fresco, the famous fresco that I showed you at the outset. The fresco that showed Çatalhöyük, or the fresco that supposedly showed Çatalhöyük in the outskirts of Hasan Dağı, doesn't reveal the actuality which has been constructed here. What is the first thing that catches your attention? If you ask yourself this question, I'm sure that every single one of you will say, "Hocam, where are the streets? There are no streets here." Indeed, you would be perfectly, correct. If you look at the, layout here, there are no streets. There's no grid plan. There are no 90-degree intersections of anything. The grid plan doesn't seem to apply here at all. Instead, you have flat-roofed houses, and these flat-roofed the houses have, connections between, each other, which is supplied with stairs that bridge the level differences. The level differences that you see here, as you see here, are bridged by ladders. Ladders that can be removed if you don't want someone to come. And in this regard, the idea of protection comes to mind. How did they protect themselves? When you think of a fortified site, you immediately think of a fortification wall, a wall that makes it impossible to enter. Here, there is no fortification wall. There's no the big, wall around the, settlement. There's only a kind of blind, wall without, windows. In this part of the slide, as you, see, there are no windows, no fenestration at all, just a blind wall. So if you have a blind wall that denies access, it doesn't invite entry. And in the same manner, if you remove your ladder, if you pull your ladder out, then there will not be a possibility to access from one roof to another. And if there are no streets, and if there are no, the other ways of, entry, well, where are the doors? There are no doors here. You see that there are various, windows, and the entry was from the roof. Entry and exit was through the, roof, and the openings in the, roof provided the ventilation as well as the means of circulation. Here there's a closer view. In this you can see that there are empty places between the houses which were garbage yards, and these garbages have been examined to give an idea about what the diet of these early people was. And you see that the doors don't exist, the ladders are in some of them, and the entry is through these openings on the roof. So here you see an entry, there is another, and there is another entry, and this is a different mode of existence. And you probably are thinking back to the first slide I showed you from the Çorum, from the bus station on the way to Çorum, where there was a window with a ladder leading to it. Looking at the plans, you will see much better what I indicated earlier. There are no streets here. The houses are not in the grid, plan. They don't have the streets separating them. They have party walls. They have joint walls. And if you look inside each unit, the units have differentiations in the form of shallow platforms. So this inner, division, which you see on the slides here, you see these minor divisions. They were probably perishable walls of rushes or plants which separated certain areas, and each house seems to have a more specialized area in the corner. Here also there is the change of information, how the information from the 50s has become transformed today in the 2020s. You see that some of the units have S's on them, SS, and some of the units have no appellation whatsoever. When Jim Millard excavated this site, he found wall paintings in some of the units. So the units which had wall paintings were designated as shrines by him. And those he called S's, the S units. The ones which had the paintings were the S units, and they were designated as shrines. The ones in which there was no trace of paint or wall paintings were more ordinary, so he probably felt that these were the normal dwelling units. But now the excavations have revealed that the units where Millard did not find traces of paint actually did have paint. But these paint, the fragments, residues, were not very strong, so they could not be seen with the minute technology of that time. So the theory of separating the shrines and the rest of the units is a bit more shaky right now. We are talking about more shrines, and yes, we were talking about no architectural differentiation, because the units were same. And if you say that the ones that have the paint or the pictures are the shrines because they're more elaborated, then you are talking about an architectural differentiation which is achieved by the interior space definition of the treatment of the walls with or without the frescoes. Well, that is no longer valid right now. But we still have not discovered a special, more monumental building, a building which is different than the others, like a religious, structure. So there's no mosque or church or any differentiating structure. All units look the same, and all of them seem to have traces of, paint in them. And the ones that don't are probably areas of storage. A typical unit, when examined closer, can be seen on the screen. And you see the platforms here much better. And the platforms, as I said, were probably differentiated with removable walls or perishable walls. And each unit had a hearth in which a fire was burning. And here they probably warmed themselves in the winter by having a fire, and they also did their cooking. And the ventilation was through the opening in the roof, and access to that was with the ladder. So the opening in the roof provided the ventilation as well as the circulation in every sense. Within these walls, the plaster which was painted seems to have been replaced continuously. And some of the frescoes which were found seem to have several hundred layers. I mean, more than 100 layers on one. And it is felt that this was probably a memorial function to paint and repaint a fresco to keep the memory of something past alive. And in the areas which did not have paint, there was white plaster. And it is felt that the reflection from the white plaster provided a kind of lighting which made it possible to see what you were cutting or cooking in a semi-dark environment, and coupled with the light coming in from the roof, which is the door, then you solved the light problem. If we look closely at some examples of the frescoes and the paintings, we see that they are associated with the lives of the Çatalhöyük people. They were settled since they had these houses. We have the evidence for farming. They could grow, wheat, and we have domestication of animals as well. But the memory of the hunting, days was still there. And on one wall, you see a wild animal, and you see the people who are trying to capture the animal. A collective effort, a powerful and dangerous, endeavor. And you have to use your imagination, you have to use your, strength, you have to use the common, power in order to be able to capture the animal. On another, wall, there is the shallow relief of a mother, goddess, giving, birth. There's a veil in front of her. She's in the birth-giving, position. And depending on some of the other evidences of the female representation, there seems to be a cult of a female, deity here. And the idea of reproduction, the idea of giving a life, the idea of birth and sustenance seems to be associated with a mother goddess, according to the evidence. Some other evidences of reconstructed shrines show painted vultures that you see here with decapitated human heads. And this gives us some sense about the funerary beliefs, the funerary customs of the Çatalhöyük people, but they are conjectural, of course. And within this conjecture, you see the priests conducting special, ceremonies, and horns of consecration here. Again, more vultures on the wall. And burials of heads underneath the floors. So the idea that there is respect to the dead, the idea that there is an importance given to the sustenance of memory seems to be sensed in the Çatalhöyük walls. The horns of consecration emerge in several instances. This is a reconstruction in the Anatolian Civilizations Museum in a case, but in actual in situ situation, you see the horns of the bull actually inbuilt into a platform in the floor, and the reconstruction of this shows even better. So you have the horns of consecration, which you will encounter again with the Minoans and Mycenaeans several thousand years later in our classes that we'll see ahead. But other than the horns of consecration, the most prevalent, evidence is the existence of a female representation. And this female representation is not so much in the fresco paintings, but in the form of figurines, stone figurines like this one. You can tell that this very simple stone figurine is a female depiction because of the life-giving the parts of the body here. Everything else is lost in detail. You see the joined arms, you see the thighs, and the impression is a rather massive figure. A small figurine with a massive stance, a rather hefty look. She is small, but she is strong. She is the life giver. She is the one who will make life, hence the stone, figurines. You don't even see the mouth. the eyes are shown barely, in the, face, but the breasts here are perhaps the most identifiable the elements of the body, together with the huge thighs that she possesses. There are also twin goddesses, and in the twin goddesses also there are the breasts that you see and almost nothing else. No facial expression, no beautiful Aphrodite aesthetic figures, here, but a female presence, a female awareness, an awareness of the female through, fertility, as you see with the depiction of the breasts. The most famous of these, figurines is the clay figurine here from Çatalhöyük, showing a rather, well-endowed, lady, bodily speaking, who is seated in a throne between two wild animals. Look at her, legs. Look at her thighs. Look at her breasts. She is majestic. She is strong. She is in, command. And the depiction, together with the wild, animals, gives the idea that she is in consort, with nature, and this idea of, commanding even, nature, commanding, life, is very apparent here. The figurine was found very close to a grain depot. So if grain is a form of sustenance for life, having this particular figurine in connection with the source of food or source of the storage of food might be meaningful in that sense. The mother figurine, the mother goddess, the female goddess, is shown in other guises as well. In this particular example, you have the leopards, and just like the seated goddess on the throne of the leopards, the wild animals, here you see her in company of a wild animal again. Then without the goddess, there are two wild animals here frolicking together, and these are the stories which are enhanced by paint. So the idea that you can differentiate something by the applications of stories, of narratives, which are enhanced even further by paint, is very important. And at this point, I would like to make a contrast with some of the pottery that has been found there. The monochrome ware, meaning single-colored pottery, is a cooking pot here. I mean, a pot where you can cook what is inside above a wood-burning fire. So it is a cooking pot. And in this pot and several others like it, there is absolutely no urge to try to paint. So again, if you use a kind of logic in the absence of written evidences, written memoirs, or the contemporary witnesses, then you have to make conjectures. And here it might be suggested, or it has been suggested, that at the time when the wall frescoes were very, very important, paint and color were reserved for those. And the monochrome wares and the units in which these monochrome monochrome wares were found, are units where the walls are polychromatic. So you have the attention paid to the wall, differentiating the wall with the depiction of the narrative, making the pot quite simple and utilitarian without any decoration at all. But if you look at some later pottery, a slightly later pottery, you see that in contrast to the monochrome pottery, the paint is being used. You have ochre and white, simple geometric designs. And one archaeologist has interpreted this as a kind of transitional phase where the rate of the frescoes on the wall begins to decrease. This time the paint is also very much apparent, or beginning to be apparent in the pots themselves. So this points to the fact that the representations, depicting a hunt or depicting the wild animals and using a precious color to create these walls had a significance, a memorial significance, and it was important to keep the memory going on. And if you were hunting, then you got a kind of strength from looking at the wall of a captured hunt through representation. But once they became more settled, and once the strength needed for that kind of activity began to decrease, then the paint started to be utilized for purposes like this one too. But again, that is a conjecture. But it shows how, in the absence of writing, you have to utilize the evidence in a creative way, but within limits. And once new evidence comes, then your theory might become totally vanishing. Now, the painted pottery from Hacular also points to differences in the units that we have there. If you look at this reconstruction from Hacular, you will see that there are doors opening to the courtyard. The roofs are still flat, so they still can be utilized as industrial areas or gathering areas for various various but there are also the common areas. But you also see a fortification wall surrounding the small unit. So there is the difference in the economic production here. If you start rearing a surplus product, then the storage of that product and then the protection of that product becomes important. And the archaeological evidence, the nature of the structures, the nature of their layout can always give you important clues about this. And in the excavation here, you see that this configuration is quite different than the one that I showed to you in Çatalhöyük. So obviously there is a difference that is taking place in the lifestyle, and this lifestyle is affecting decisions in the way that the units of dwelling or units for other purposes are being designed. But old habits die hard. In Hacular as well, the figurines of the mother, goddess, the themes of, nurturing, the themes of, giving, birth, the themes of the continuity of, life are quite important. And you see the baked clay statuette in this case as well. You see another clay figurine here, again with the breasts, the buttocks, showing the female aspects, not in terms of beauty, but in terms of attribute. Very, very important. Other evidences that come from Çatalhöyük are various. I mean, besides the architecture, besides the pots themselves, there are also amulets, there are bracelets, very much like the ones we saw in Karain. So here in this picture, you see teeth of animal which are pierced, and then they are beaded with other bones and precious stones. And here you have a stone bracelet. So there was attention to bodily protection or bodily appearance or bodily whatever here as well. Another example of beads in the various precious or semi-precious stones that were found in Çatalhöyük, you see on the screen. This last slide that I'm showing to you is quite important, because in the modern village where Ayhan Hodder is working right now, and where James Mellart had started to work, there were clues about the lifestyle that they felt could shed light on certain aspects of the life of the Çatalhöyük people as well. Now, of course, with modernization and all of that, lifestyles have changed. But in those times, the archaeologists they had many ethnographic studies, and they looked at the villagers living in the land very close to the höyük. They looked at the roofs. They looked at how the roofs were utilized for drying grains and other forms of production. And many of the female the workers in Çatalhöyük are still being derived from the modern villagers, because Ayhan Hodder believes that they have a certain sensitivity in grains, for example. You need a very good eye in archaeology, and if you are trying to use the naked eye in weeding out certain details from the rubbish, well, who better could do that than the mother or wife who spends many hours cleaning rice or cleaning lentils from stones and other impurities. So the females in the village were consciously and very often utilized as workers in the excavations at Çatalhöyük. And what better way to honor an archaeological site known for its the mother goddess or female goddesses, and to have these female workers contributing to the livelihood of their families. Well, thank you very much. We shall continue with this episode in our next class. Take care.